So to start us off, I would like to welcome Amanda Lowe. Amanda Lowe is our Director of Government Affairs at National PTA. She brings experience working on special education advocacy and as a teacher to her work here. In her role, she works with our volunteer leadership on PTA's public policy platform and in supporting our membership and leadership to be advocates for all children.
Great, thanks so much, Rebecca. It's such a joy to be here, and thank you to everyone who's joining us for tonight's webinar. So the title of tonight's webinar, Advocating for School Funding with an Equity Lens, it sounds like a broad topic, but having an understanding about some of the basics about school funding, particularly at the local level, and also knowing where to look for more information is actually key to advocacy. I know our panel a little bit later in tonight's program will discuss this more and how to make that a reality. Next slide, please. So why should we care about school funding? Well, at the federal level, funding mainly goes to some of the big education programs that most of us have heard about and which are absolutely key for ensuring educational equity. For example, there's a Title I program, which provides schools and districts funding to meet some of the additional costs of educating children from low-income households or high-poverty communities. There's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, which provides federal funding for the education of children with disabilities. And then also some smaller but crucial programs, such as the statewide family engagement centers, which are near and dear to National PTA, and which implement and enhance effective family engagement policies, programs, and activities. We know that these types of programs are critical for students, and National PTA has a long and proud history of advocating for these programs, as well as others. And we're happy to say that our advocacy efforts do result in increased funding. For example, the FY 2021 appropriations saw a 25% increase for the statewide family engagement centers. But what about all the school funding that doesn't come from the federal government? Next slide. The responsibility for K-12 education rests with states under the Constitution. However, there's an obvious national interest in the quality of the nation's public schools. So as we just mentioned, the federal government provides assistance to states and schools. However, while we often hear about the federal share of the education budget, the vast majority, and this is important, comes from states and locals. In fact, approximately 48% of a school's budget comes from state resources, including state income taxes, sales tax, and fees, and another approximate 44% is contributed locally, primarily through property tax of homeowners in the area. So where does the money go? Interestingly, while most public and private organizations and businesses have around 35 to 40% of their budgets tied to personnel and benefits, about 80% of school district budgets is actually spent on labor costs. In other words, salaries and benefits for staff. So who makes the decisions? Well, in the most simple definition, a school budget describes a district's plan for the upcoming year as related to anticipated revenues and expenditures. What's really interesting about school budgets is that they actually allow districts to translate sometimes intangible missions or objectives into reality by outlining and providing specific programs and funding. So who makes the decisions? Well, at the local and district level, budget discussions and work will typically involve school administrators, school boards, school employees, and community members. But as noted in the slide, the local school board must vote to approve the final budget. So in closing, if, for example, instruction or health and safety or counseling services in your school or district are important to you, understanding how the budget works and how resources are allocated is vitally important to advocacy moving forward. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Bauer. I'm a family engagement specialist at National PTA, and I'm happy to share some of the results from our recent research project. So as Amanda was saying, We know school funding is a really important advocacy issue because so many of the changes we want to see in our schools require money to make them happen. With this in mind, we at National PTA set out to connect with families around this topic. We partnered with 5 district council PTAs, Austin, Vancouver, Pinellas, Duval, and Hillsborough, to listen and learn from families. And that's in Texas, Washington, and Florida. We wanted to get a better sense of families' opinions and their priorities so that we could more effectively engage stakeholders around these issues. And we wanted to engage stakeholders by elevating parent voice in this way. There are a few ways we were thinking about equity when it came to this project. And some of our equity goals were more successful than others. But the first one was to listen to families who were representative of the community. Sounds pretty straightforward. Second was looking at the data and disaggregating it based on district, race, income, and income level. And third, we wanted to empower grantees to support their own communities and understand the issues facing their specific constituencies, which is why we gave a district level report to each one of the participants as well. Next slide. So next up, how did we do? Overall, we did pretty well. We engaged 164 participants across 5 school districts, conducting 22 virtual listening sessions, 5 of which were in Spanish, and about a quarter of all of the parents were Spanish speakers. You can see it was also a fairly racially diverse group with an underrepresentation of Asian or Pacific Islander families. Our participants were also diverse in terms of socioeconomic status, but the sample was primarily middle-aged women. A more detailed breakdown is available in the full report, which we'll make sure to link to in the chat. Next slide. So what did we find out? First off, families are eager to learn more about school funding, but they don't know what to do. They don't know where to go and they don't know what to do when it comes to this issue. We spoke to families and we heard from a lot of parents that they feel totally clueless and they're not sure where to start. But something that was even more concerning when it comes to advocacy efforts is parents who set out to educate themselves on the topic still struggle to make sense of what's out there. This is an equity issue because we don't simply need the districts to publish this information somewhere on the internet. We need it to be available in ways that all parents can make sense of. Next slide. And that's clearly not what's happening right now. Less than a third of participants reported that they had a general understanding of how their school district uses its funding. And even fewer said they know where to go to get this kind of information. As you can see from some of the quotes here, parents have a lot of questions, and some are really broad questions like where does the money come from? And others are more specific as to why different schools get different amounts. Next slide. Families weren't sure if money in their district was being used wisely either. They were skeptical of the district's role. Participants shared that sometimes it was hard to tell if an aspect of school life was underfunded or if the funding was there and it was being used in ineffective ways. Parents were frustrated around instances of waste, priorities they disagreed with, and logistical challenges. One example of this came from a parent in Duval County, Florida, who said that her 6th grader gets physical education every single day, and her elementary school age child gets it once a week. So there's not necessarily a shortage of resources.
That's no right. It's over. No, not yet. It's not.
In the district when it comes to physical education, but rather the way that money is being allocated isn't meeting the family's needs. Overall, we noticed that this lack of transparency, this lack of explanation around school funding led to a lack of trust in the district. Participants cited district central office staff as the #1 area where they would cut funding to. While this finding does say a lot about participants' opinions, it is also important to note that district central office staff account for less than 2% of the district's budget. So there's not a whole lot of area to trim there. Next slide. Overall, parents also told us that they want schools that have children with greater needs to get more resources. Across all of the districts, parents preferred the idea of giving each school what it needs rather than giving each school the same amount of money. Next slide. In the listening sessions, we presented participants with a real-life example to gauge their views on this topic. We shared an example of an elementary school in their district that had a low per pupil expenditure and one that had a much higher one, sometimes as much as $9,000 more per kid. Families did tend to be surprised to see that there was such a stark difference between schools, but most often their main emotion was curiosity, and they wanted to know why there was this difference. They predicted that a school's neighborhood, the incomes of families in that neighborhood, and if the school had title status might be reasons behind this difference, but they really wanted more information. Most did share that if they got that information and it confirmed that schools were receiving more money because they did in fact need more resources, then in that case, they didn't have a major issue with the disparity. You can see in this chart that we asked the question two ways, and both times parents chose the answers that reflected a value for educational equity. And while there was variation across the 5 districts, in each one, the majority of parents chose funding based on need as the preferred model. Next slide. Our next finding was that PTAs and other fundraising groups are supporting basic school functions. And parents also said that teachers are providing basic supplies as well. When PTAs and other sources are making up for gaps in funding in this way, it can become really challenging to tell where exactly the district is falling short. Next slide. So you can see here a full list of some of the areas where PTAs and other groups are helping to fund everything from school supplies, supplies for the nurse, technology, copy paper, and often, at least traditionally, people think of PTAs as paying for extras, maybe a graduation celebration or teacher appreciation breakfast. But as you see in the quote here, PTAs are funding things like salaries in some cases. This can pose challenges when it comes to advocacy, because PTAs do need to be seen as collaborating with the school and acting as a team player, providing money where it's needed, whether that's a reading specialist or copy paper. But at the same time, if they are providing some of these essentials, it can make it difficult to advocate for the district to cover those costs. It's a tension that advocates need to navigate carefully. Next slide. Our last finding was that families believe that schools need more funding. This isn't shocking, and it's similar to a lot of other research that's out there. From our survey data, 62% of parents believe that their own child's school needs more money, and 77% believe there needs to be more funding for schools nationwide. Across all 5 districts, teachers and teachers' aides was a top area where parents wanted to increase funding. Counseling services and specialized services, which include special education, English language support, etc., was also an area where parents saw a lot of unmet needs. So as you can see from this slide, teachers, counselors, and specialized services stand out far on the left. Oh, can you go back? Stands out on the left because participants ranked them as a priority for increased funding, and very few wanted to cut funding in these areas. But a lot of the categories, those ones in the middle in the circle, like facilities, transportation, music, and arts, people had differing opinions. So some people really wanted to increase funding and others wanted to decrease funding. And this is an interesting advocacy issue you might face because people don't all agree about where the money should go. And it's something that you kind of need to take poll of and take stock of in your own community to gauge. And you'll see far on the right that, again, the district center office staff was pretty universally chosen as an area for potential cuts. Next. So families want more money for schools, but where exactly do they want it to come from? The resounding answer is where they don't want it to come from, with only 2% saying that private organizations should be providing this extra money. Interestingly, white participants, participants making more money, and participants with higher levels of education were more likely to say the extra money should come from the state, whereas parents who didn't have a college degree were more likely to feel that the responsibility should fall on the federal government. Next slide. So let's dive into some of these priority areas for increased funding, the first and highest of which was teachers. 61% of our participants chose teachers and teachers' aides as a priority for increased funding. Participants advocated not only for funding to hire more teachers, but also to pay existing teachers higher salaries. In some instances, parents even cited that they noticed the effects of the teacher shortages, whether that was because teachers are missing from their kids' classes and they have like a rotating selection of substitutes, or because the school has been forced to offer fewer courses, fewer electives, fewer APs because they don't have enough personnel to staff them. Next slide. So we see a similar issue when it comes to counselors and counseling services. 39% of our parents indicated this was a priority area, and here too, there just aren't enough counselors. They highlighted the need to hire more counselors so that students wouldn't have to wait so long to be evaluated and to receive much needed support. Parents also indicated that there was a lot of variety when it came to the quality of the counseling services, not only between different schools in a district, but even just between two counselors at the very same school. Counseling services is always an important issue, but in terms of advocacy, it's particularly timely as parents continue to express concerns around the mental health impacts of COVID-19 right now and also potentially for years to come. Next slide. Lastly, we have specialized services, where 32% of our parents marked this as a priority area. While the focus was primarily on special education and English language learners, families also shared that any child who fell outside the bell curve, any child that learns or thinks a little bit differently, including gifted students, needed additional support, which is why you'll see here that, again, parents indicated the need for more teachers' aides so that they could get the level of individualized instruction that they wanted for their children. So as you can tell, we learned a lot from these listening sessions and from the survey data. And there are all sorts of ways you can use this research to fuel your advocacy work moving forward. With that in mind, I'm excited to turn it over to Marques Ivey, who's going to moderate our panel this evening. Marques Ivey is currently a member of the Board of Education for Aurora Public Schools. He has previously served as National PTA's VP of Advocacy and on the Board of Directors for Colorado PTA. He and his wife have 3 children. Take it away, Marques.
Great. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And just welcome to everyone this evening. Just really a pleasure to be back and to be able to speak and actually, quite frankly, hear all of the great responses we're about to hear. So I'd like to take this time to introduce our panel this evening. First, we have Yvonne Johnson. She is the Vice President of Advocacy for National PTA. She is also the chair of the National PTA Legislative Committee. She has been involved in PTA in various capacities for nearly 30 years, and she and her husband also have 3 children and 1 grandchild. I'd also like to welcome Jen Martinez. She is the president of Florida PTA, and she has been committed to PTA and a community leader for over 20 years, including service at the local and council level. She resides in Palm Beach County with her husband and 4 children. And finally, last but not least, we have Laurie Solis, who is currently the president of Austin Council of PTAs. She has also served as a PTA leader at the local level. She played a central role in managing the school funding community listening sessions in Austin. So with that, I just want to say welcome to our panel. And I'm going to start off asking our first question. And I'm going to send this over to you, Laurie. So hopefully you're ready. So Austin Council of PTAs were involved in the initiative that Rebecca basically talked about a few minutes ago. Can you share any ahas from the process, or if you could, explain how Austin PTA is using this experience with an equity lens to further advocacy efforts? You got 4 minutes. I'm gonna keep time though. You got 4 minutes.
All right, sounds good. Well, I do have to do some thank yous for this opportunity that was given to our council and our campus PTAs. There's over 110 campus PTAs for Austin. And even though I'm a panelist tonight, I represent a board of esteemed colleagues who believe in this work and believe in the people that they're doing it with. And so I want to just start there with some gratitude. Are you guys hearing me okay?
I hear you just fine.
Okay, great. So I also want to start with just, confirming what educational equity means, and because that jargon is kind of thrown out there. And we've also learned as an aha moment that not everyone even knows the jargon. So educational equity means that each child receives what they need to develop their full academic and social potential. And I think hand in hand is inclusion, right? Creating a space that's welcoming, where people feel safe to voice their opinions and do it in a space that they feel safe and trusted. So here in Texas, our national average for per pupil spending is, or actually the national average for per pupil spending, let's start there. National average is $14,439 per pupil. Our Texas state average is $9,577. So we're already below our national average. Our district does pay a little bit more per pupil. We're at $10,400 per student, but still well below our national average. So as a state, we've got some making up to do. Also, Austin ISD is one of the highest payers back to our state in form of recapture. So just in August of 2020, Austin ISD sent a big fat check of $618.2 million back to our state. So, and that doesn't necessarily go to education. So that's a big advocacy topic. I think in terms of the process, aha moments for us, I mean, I'll say that we consider ourselves in Austin to be a pretty savvy city, knowledgeable about issues, and thought, hey, no problem. We can get 40 people in our sleep to participate in these listening sessions. And then realized very quickly that not everyone was at the same level. Not everyone wanted to be engaged. And if we really wanted to be intentional about the voices that we invited to the table, we were going to need to change our outreach efforts. And so we became more intentional about who those people were that we wanted to be invited and how we provided that outreach, which ended up being one-to-one phone calls. We knew PTA leaders, we know people who knew people, and that's how we started. And we were able to offer 2 sessions, English and Spanish. And I think kind of the takeaways from us were the feedback were that we needed to meet people where they're at, because that knowledge spectrum on advocacy, on state funding, on school funding, per pupil, recapture, all of that jargon is so vast. And we needed to meet people where they're at in order for them to feel okay about being in that space. And I also want to just think that the biggest kind of while I was in the listening grant, I think the perceptions of why schools were funded or why they looked that way, why they felt their school looked, you know, maybe debilitated, they took that personal responsibility on their own selves, on their household, and said, well, we don't feel we pay enough property tax, and therefore that's the way our school looks. And that couldn't have been further from the truth. So those were my individual takeaways. But I also just kind of, at the end of it, we're always, maybe there's a big perception out there that we don't get marginalized communities to the table, but we can, and they are willing to engage. It's just that we might need to be more agile in how we provide that outreach, and also be very intentional about that space of inclusion and allowing them to feel they're free to voice their opinion or their questions in a safe space. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Laurie. That was great information, quite frankly. So I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to ask Jen a question. Jen, can you share a little about Florida PTA's advocacy around school funding and how you are supporting your district and local PTA leaders to be a part of advocacy in their community and in your state context?
Thank you so much, Marques. First, a shout out to our From Reports to Grants team. This was a 2-year process, and I was very thankful for the opportunity to be the leader for over 1.5 years. The information that we received was illuminating. Our work on the program has been a flashlight into connecting national, state, and district issues. In Florida, since we're a local control state, much of our desegregated nuanced data analysis is done at a district level. It can make it difficult to advocate for every child because, like many states with 67 counties all being different, you need to dig in, see what the needs are versus that one-size-fits-all budgetary alignments that schools typically get. When you dig in, it becomes apparent that equal is not equitable, driving home our advocacy efforts across the state for adequate public school funding and less unfunded mandates. When you are advocating at a district level, you can be blind to the gaps that would be clearer if the data collection and collection requirements were refined by the state. You can develop those same blind spots with your district administration. However, when a statewide view is developed, we can see more clearly that gaps need to be addressed and require understanding from areas across the large state that do not have the same demographic mix. For example, how do you explain to members in Duval County, which is the north part of our state with an ELL population of 5.9%, or just under them in Volusia County at 6%, and then move to the central of the state where it's more like 10%, or the southernmost part of our state, which is Miami-Dade, at near 20%, and explain where those funding differences need to be and why they need to be. And you have over 80% of the parents agreeing that funding should be where the needs are. However, that is not usually how our budgets are developed. Our ELL learners need to be improved services so that these students and the increasing immigrant population in our state can have the resources they need. Having easily accessed statewide data helps for our membership all over the state to understand the meaning of advocate for every child with one voice. To that end, we went around the state reaching over 3,000 stakeholders. That's pre-COVID-19, of course. And we went over the narratives and why the data is so important. We taught stakeholders how they can use the data as a tool and really define where the PTAs are filling those gaps and how that can be detrimental in the long run. It doesn't give the adequate missing funding. And when you put that Band-Aid over, it's like, oh, well, you've always done it that way. Why do you need the money now? That gave us cause for pause. It's like telling parents that for so long, that was like the biggest marketing point. Yes, let's go join the PTA and let's raise money for all the things our school needs. But then when you really dig in and you get to the mission and what PTA is really all about, it brings you back to advocacy. You learn and you realize how filling those gaps can create disparities, and it can set schools basically against each other. You have to start asking yourself the question, why does this school get 20 new computers and the school down the street has all old ones? Oh, well, the answer sometimes is, oh, well, that school has a more active PTA, so they bought all that stuff. This allowed us to have very true and unique conversations within ourselves. Reviewing the data at the school, state, and district levels was so valuable. Something we really tried to focus on with the stakeholders was to dig down, take those report cards, see where those achievement gaps were, what the pure pupil funding was, and how the money was being spent throughout your district. Then when you dug in and you saw your subgroups and you see where the gaps are, you can assess and develop what programming you could offer that would help supplement, not replace the funding that should be coming from the district or the state, but supplement and enhance through programming what the districts and schools are already providing. Helping to build that family engagement component and having relevant programming for the current needs in the community. It also allowed us to see growth beyond a school grade and see learning gains and see more through the data analysis. When they first approached us about this, many of us were like, no, data, FERPA, we have to protect everything. But then when you sit down and you really see what the data that is there and how important it is, we need this data. This is the data that's for good. It's one of the hashtags that we created for our program. And we would go around saying hashtag data for good and explaining how it did not apply to FERPA. Once we saw the importance of the data, we went to our coalitions partners like real estate brokers, the League of Women Voters, school boards, and more. And we asked them to come to this training and come to the table so they can see how to dig in deep, adequately use their resources, and use the report cards as a tool. These report cards show aspects of what is going on across our schools, our districts, and across our state. And it can be a tool for all parents and all stakeholders. And so that unique information helps us at all levels, and that's why it's so important.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen, for that. So we are hitting you all with information tonight. Yeah, I hope y'all taking notes. So, all right. So the next question is going to be for Yvonne. So here you go, Yvonne. How do the findings shared connect to National PTA's public policy platform, and what types of advocacy should local leaders expect to see from National PTA in the coming year?
Thank you so much, Marcus. I just want to make sure I was unmuted. So this year's 117th Congress Public Policy Platform, it's interesting. What we did, my legislative committee this year, we surveyed our members to find out what you wanted to most for us to ask our members of Congress for. Like what would our Hill asks be? What are we going to focus on? And the number one thing was public school funding. And it was interesting because when we were analyzing it, we thought, is this have to do COVID related because obviously we surveyed everyone in the last year and we had the pandemic going on. And it's interesting because nothing has really changed in the last 5 years. Parents are very focused on public school funding and where it comes from. And I know Amanda in the early part of the presentation talked about this, that only about 10.5% of the budget comes from the federal government. A lot of parents out there feel that there should be more money coming from the federal government. But as parents, you should be looking at your school report cards that Jen referenced. Go onto your Department of Education websites and find out how much per pupil is being spent from on each student and where the money's coming from, how much is coming from the federal government, how much is coming from the state. But 60% usually is coming from the local funds. And so that's taxpayer or, based on property values. So you might have districts that are in very impoverished areas and their tax property is not very high, so they get less resources because 60% of that budget comes from local funds. And so as PTA, we want to advocate for every child, no matter where they live, right? So you really need to dig in deep onto your Department of Education websites because that will give you more information. Things that National PTA is focusing on as far as our public school funding is we will always ask for money and more funding for IDEA, the Individual Disabilities in Education Act, and that's special education. We also will always ask for Title I money. That's money that comes from schools that might be in less advantaged backgrounds. We also this year are adding a lot of asks around the COVID funding. We understand during these unprecedented times that things are very different. And in the past, and I was listening to what my fellow panelists were talking about how we raise money for PTA and then we pay for things, like I've never actually heard of paying for salaries. That I learned something new tonight because I did not know that PTAs paid for salaries because in my state in Delaware, that does not happen. I guess it depends where you live, but we do raise money and we help offset the cost for a school. A principal sits down and says, oh, I need this reading program or I need this, and you fund that, right? But it shouldn't be that way. It should be your voice counts. You should be being involved in how those budgets are being made and how the money is being spent, especially at the local level, because you have more of an impact at the local level, which 60% of the budget overall for your school district is going to come from local money. So you should be, get involved in your finance there. Every school district has like an oversight financial committee, and the school board discusses these things. And actually, we're right now, this time of the year is when school districts are starting to talk about their budgets, and then they'll finalize them at the end of the fiscal year for the new fiscal year. And you should be part of those discussions and making sure that the funding is going to the child, into the classroom. Amanda talked a little bit about how when you look at school budgets, you see that people, salaries and benefits, it goes to like 85% of a budget. In my local school district, we have a CFO, she's fabulous, and she does this pie chart. And when you see it in a pie chart, which it really tells you how so much local money goes to paying for people. And so you want more money to go towards resources, wraparound services for our students, and kids are going to need mental health counselors. This is a big thing we're advocating for in a public policy platform this year, is that we want more money invested from the federal government. The federal average is a one mental health counselor to 250 students. I think it should be 1 to 20, right? Well, let's compromise in the middle and get those mental health counselors. So we're really focused at the national level, obviously on the federal funding and what we can ask our members of Congress. As you know, many of you probably, are registered. We have our legislative conference coming up in less than 2 weeks. And we will be asking our members of Congress for a lot of funding for these issues, for family engagement centers, for the things that I just talked about, the COVID packages, nutrition, SEL resources, mental health counselors, things that our students really need, because our kids have been on a computer, right, for a year. They have not really had a lot of socialization. They might not have even had sports or after school activities, depending upon where you live in the country. And these kids want socialization. So they're dealing with a lot. The suicide rate is up. So we really need to be focusing on giving them social emotional learning resources. So our public policy agenda can be found at pta.org/advocacy. And it's the 117th Congress. And really it's not a hard thing to read. It really tells you where we're focused on where we want our federal funding to come from.
Excellent, excellent. All right. So I'm gonna throw out a question to all our panelists. And I may even participate in this one just because I think it's important, but I'm gonna throw out this question to everyone. So what advice do you have for PTA leaders who want to begin advocating for school funding, but aren't sure where to start? So with that, I'm gonna give you each a couple minutes just to speak. Let's start with Laurie, since you were the first one to speak. Let's start with you on this question.
Sure. So one, I think that it's always important for us to understand and take away small victories. So just start with where you're at, start as an open conversation, invite people to this community conversation, and know that you can build, because this is not a one and done conversation. This is one that you could have, every month, every quarter. This is something that you can build on. I would also just say that maybe people do need to have understanding of the jargon. So it's important to maybe have at the ready those that are just now beginning this conversation and need those definitions, and those that are on the advanced end that probably you're just connecting them to resources where they can learn more. And I mean, those are kind of the two big things that I would say as we go forward.
Excellent. Jen, what's your thoughts on this?
Hi, Marques. Thank you. When we're first starting out, sometimes with our parents, we have to change that word advocate and just explain it different. Like a lot of times when you have new parents and you're coming in and they're like, oh, what does advocate, even mean? What are you doing? I'd say when you're starting at that grassroots level, change that narrative and say, oh, have you ever gone to a parent teacher conference? Oh, yes. Well, that's stage one. That's advocating for your child. Now build on that. When you find out things that are going on and you want to make a difference, especially like funding, when you're finding things out, join your PTA, get your voice in there and join the other millions of voices that are advocating for all children. When you have those local levels, go through your SAC, your school advisory councils, find out what's going on, get your input, get the input from the principal and the partnership there. Partner with your school boards and attend your school board meeting and find out what's going on. Those are public, and they're typically right now, even in the pandemic, even though they're meeting in person, they're online to where you can watch them, or you can even watch them after the fact. And getting in at those ground levels will all of a sudden open your eyes to a larger picture, and you'll be like, I didn't even know that this was out here. And then you become part of that PTA family, and it just keeps growing. And then you just expand your research and your knowledge base. And then before you know it, you are a pro and you're advocating all over the place for the benefits of all children. It's really just taking that first step at that grassroots level. And if you don't know where to start, with your PTA is always a great first place.
Awesome. Yep. Couldn't agree with you more. Yvonne, what talk to us about that. What is your thoughts with respect to that?
So, I want to just elaborate a little bit about what Jen was saying. So to me, I have a saying that I live by: never underestimate the power of a parent's voice, because as a parent or a PTA member or a community member, your voice counts. And like, advocacy can be scary for people. People hear the word and they think, oh, I don't know how to do that. But every time you go to a school board meeting and you speak to the school board about an issue, even when you're talking to your building leader and you're sharing about information that you've heard in the building, or you're just speaking to other parents, that's advocacy. It's speaking up and for others. That's all it means. But as soon as you get the advocacy bite, like I got involved, my son's 35, he was in kindergarten, there was an issue in his school, and someone said, join the PTA And then, you know, you'll see how you can make a difference. And I did, and I learned that my voice counted, and it snowballed from there, and I've been advocating ever since. And so, and I'm not saying that everyone's going to be that way, but once you know that your voice has counted and made a difference for children, not just your own, because we all know that we usually get involved originally because we are advocating for our own kids. But once you see that you've made impact on a policy, on a piece of legislation, or an issue in your school or in your school district, then you know that your voice counts, and then other people follow. That's grassroots advocacy, and that's really the one that's very meaningful. I always believe that a decision maker, whether it's a superintendent, a school board member, a local legislator, a federal legislator, when they see you as a grassroots volunteer speaking up about an issue, they really listen to you. You're not being paid to do this, so they know that your passion is real, and so they pay attention to you. One time, I finished with this. One time, a legislator told me that when he gets one email, he'll respond. When he gets 3, he's like, "Oh, there must be an issue going on." And when he gets 10, he thinks, "Oh, if there's 10 people telling me, there's probably 1,000 people upset." So that's what I mean by never underestimate the power of your voice. Email your school board and tell them you want to be involved in school budgets. You want to know how the money's being spent. And it is a complicated issue, and there is some education out there for you to do some research and learn how to understand school budgets. But it's really important to be involved, especially if your kids are grown now and you're involved still with PTA, because then you're making a difference in your community, because good public schools only make our communities better.
Excellent, excellent. And so I'm just going to throw in there as well, being a school board member and president, and now current treasurer, it is always, there are always committees with school boards. So if you can, seek to join those committees on school boards. We have about 10 committees, and they're made up of parents within the community. That's the first step. The second step is the states always have some form of education committee at the state level, and I'm talking about the state government. Look to try to join those as well, because they're always looking for local families, local parents to join those committees just the same. So with that, great conversation, everyone. So what we are going to do now is we are going to transition to audience questions. And so I have been diligently looking at the questions, and thanks to Helen as well, who has been helping out in that aspect. And I've been copying the questions. And so I'm going to throw the questions out to the panel, but I just kind of want to, we only got about 15 minutes, 16 minutes actually. So I just want to throw out the question to the panel. If we can, maybe 1 or 2 people answer, and just try to keep that time short so we can get to more questions. So the first question I'm going to throw out is, and this is a good one. This is from Deb Nolan. She said, "What if the school board doesn't allow you to be a part of those discussions?" And I think she's talking about discussions related to the budget. If I'm wrong, Deb, please make sure you note that in the chat. But who wants to answer that question? Rebecca, anyone? What happens if the school board doesn't allow you to be a part of those discussions? I got personal opinions on this, but I want to hear what everyone else says.
Marques, I'll take a stab at that one. So everyone knows your local school boards, okay, they're beholden to you. You're the constituent, you're the taxpayer, and every single board meeting has to be done in public. Everything they do has to be in public unless they're in executive session discussing personnel issues. Their minutes have to be public. Every decision that they make has to be public, and you have the right. Every school board, I guess, is different in how much time, but there is always a public comment time, and you have the right to go to that school board meeting. And let me say this, in this pandemic, I have never seen so many families so engaged, because people can do it without leaving their homes. They can do it right from their homes and get on Zoom and sign up for public comment and speak freely with how you feel about the school budget. So that's the input you can have. You can also email your school board and say, you would like to see more funding for special education or whatever it is that you're advocating for. It is a public meeting, and they need to be listening to you, because they are beholden to you.
Anyone else want to respond to that as well?
Marcus, this is Jen. I'll just add, it's important to sometimes they have committees that you can request to sit on. And a lot of times they do have workshops that can be private or in executive session, but the school board meeting itself should always be open to the public. And if it isn't, I would send an email requesting why, because they should be. And those budgets are also supposed to be online for your view. So you can even then research what you want to specifically ask about, which would help you narrow down the question and you might get an answer quicker.
Excellent, excellent. Anyone else on the panel as well? I was just looking at some of the questions, some of the answers as well, but anyone else? Go ahead.
I think I was just going to chime in with relationships. I mean, relationships are really kind of where we start the engagement process and how we are comfortable. And so I am, when new board members are elected, I'm immediately calling them or emailing them, finding out, letting them know who I am, because we do have a sphere of influence. PTA is a very big name, and if they are a board trustee, they're wanting to work with our students and our families. I can't imagine volunteering. It's not a paid position here in our school district, so I have to feel like their intention is great. And so it's for me, it starts with relationships.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I couldn't agree with you more. Everyone really made great points as well. Executive sessions should be used very sparingly. Executive sessions are dictated by law, quite frankly, and so you can only go into executive sessions for certain sections. So make sure you check your law, and then make sure that you, when it comes to public comment, make that request specifically as what section is this under with respect to the law. So that's pretty important as well, because you are a school board. And you basically hire the school board members. I say hire, we don't get paid. Many of us don't, but you hire them. So we are beholden to you all as the public. So, all right, the next question that I have here, let's see. I think this is a good one as well. It says, this is from Natalia, and I probably butchered that name and I apologize, so forgive me. She asks, can you speak more specifically to bridging the gap between the needs of large urban districts and rural districts at the state level? How do you communicate that one district may need more funding in one category than another due to local needs and costs? So did you all get that? That was a long one. So let's start with the first one. Can you speak more specifically to bridging the gap between the needs of large urban districts and rural districts at the state level? Anybody?
I'll take a stab at that also. When I think of that question as a whole, again, it's about local control. So when if you have an urban district, they are going to have one school board, and you're going to have a rural district that's going to have another school board. And the way money is spent is done locally by that school board and their superintendent, right? So if you want to have impact on that, how much money is spent, it's the same thing. You should be contacting the school board and letting them know you don't think that enough Title I money is being spent. A good example is in an urban area, for example, a lot of schools could be Title I schools. There's a lot of laws that are attached to guidelines of how they can spend the money. Know what they are. It's called the consolidated grant, and that is how Title I money is funded. There's very specific pockets of money. How much should you be used? My big one is, how much money are you using on family engagement when they really aren't using it? They're ordering pizza and saying that they're engaging families. So you really need to understand how, look and see how they're spending it. They also there's probably pockets for special education, for IDEA. There's all different pockets of how they should spend their money. But depending upon where the school district is located, like if it's in a rural area, it might be very different. There might be more Title I money there, but there might be less money of some, other things like Title IV-A might not be as large there. So school funding is complicated, but the budgets are even more complicated. But if you just break it down into how much you think should be spent, like on specific things, like wraparound services is a big thing, and that should be in every school district because all kids need wraparound services, right? And so in my state, we just started having wellness centers built in elementary schools, which is awesome because it provides a lot of wraparound services, and both of those are located in Title Title I school districts. So understand the difference between those pockets of money, and that's how you would have more of an impact of how that money's being spent. Again, communicating with your school board.
Anyone else? Anyone else want to take a stab at it? We got 9 minutes, so I want to keep us
Sorry.
on track. Anyone else?
I'll add, I'll go from a different perspective because what Yvonne said is great. Like for my county, we are so large. We have an urban and a rural area under one school board. So that's when it comes into that deep dive that we talked about, using that report card and dig it in, because you can pull up every school. So when you have that, and it all comes back to that equity lens of looking at it, well, they're already so far out there. I mean, you're having to pay teachers stipends just to drive, the hour and a half to get out there from where that we're living. They still need to have the same programs and services available to them, because across the board, these are our children, and we need to be sending the money out there to those areas to make sure that they receive the services, that they need. So everything that Yvonne said is 100% I'm on board, but I'm just using the example that sometimes they're in the same school board, and that's where you can take that research in and speak to the same school board, because it's the same people. And when you're on there, have that private conversation with that school board member that represents that area. Build that relationship, sit down, have some talking points with them and say, I'm here to help you, help these children. And so let's get on the same page on how we can work together and expand upon what the needs are out there. So, the other, 5 or 6, depending on how many school members you have, can really see what we're talking about. Or let's go on a road trip and let's go out there together and take a look at what's going on out there.
And so part 2 of that question as well was, how do you communicate that one district may need more funding in one category than another due to local needs and costs? So anybody want to toss that in there? I think there's a kind of a straightforward answer, but anyone else want to take a stab at that one? All right, I will. No. Here's the thing. Simply put, when it comes to the varying needs of your district, here's what I've done. I've partnered with other school districts in that aspect, or partner with other groups in that aspect to basically go to the House, go to the Capitol, have a conversation, meet with your legislatures. You can do that. You can actually go testify, particularly in the education committees. You should be out there. Y'all should be there when your session's in, whenever that is. You should be there sitting at that doorway saying, I'm here to testify. I'm here to talk about what's going on. And I'm here to advocate not only for my urban district, but my rural district. So I'm just throwing that out there as just an option. Go to your state houses. Try to be a part of that process. You're allowed to. It's the people's house there too. So I'm gonna throw that out. All right. Anyone else want to toss in there before I go to the next question?
I just want to add, Marques, that to your point is now it's a lot easier to go to your state house because it's probably on Zoom. You don't even have to drive there. So you should know when your committee meetings are, especially the education committee meetings. But there are other committees like the health committee, because that could be also with like mental health counselors and things. So there's a lot of joint committee meetings that are also important. And also you could be involved in your joint finance committee, which is where that's when it's allocated. So if it's at the state level, you want to attend joint finance committee meetings, because that's when they allocate how much they're going to spend here, how much they're going to spend there, and then they farm it out to the school districts. And I did notice in the chat that someone was talking about property tax. So just remember that local funding, anything that's going to be financed by your local funding, is depending upon the property value. So if you live in a very wealthy area, those kids, those schools might have a lot more than a school district that is in an urban area that might not have as high property values. That's really important to know, because the students that need the most might live in areas that don't have high property tax, and that affects the resources they get. So there's an area to really advocate for.
And Marques, I was just going to add, I don't think we've touched on this one, is a lot of districts have what we call the mill or the referendum money. Make sure you're following up on that. Those are raised for specific things, and they should have an independent oversight committee that should be followed up to make sure if they're formed to pay for fine arts teachers or mental health specialists, that's where that money should be going, and making sure that all of the schools within the district are receiving their allocation of those funds.
Absolutely. Good information,
I also
everyone.
wanted to,
oh, go ahead.
I think I just wanted to chime in and just say a couple of things. on the flip side, Yvonne, Austin ISD is a property wealthy state. So we are, paying that big check out and not seeing it in our local schools, campuses. So I think, a few years ago, we all wanted to go after recapture. But I think as we think about how we connect to, we are a large urban district, but how we connect to, it's been very difficult and challenging to think about how we advocate at the state level without finding ways that we can connect with the rural districts as well, so that we can seem like one combined force asking for the state that's also helping everyone. So we were able to connect on broadband issues this year, and really not go after recapture as much as the entire state needs funding, not just our school district. So I think it's also important that we find ways that we can connect and advocate together, because those numbers count as well.
Excellent. Okay, so we got 4 minutes and I got 4 people here. Well, it's 3 minutes now. So we got 3 minutes and I still got 4 people here. So I'm gonna just throw out a quick question. If everybody could take a minute and just kind of answer it. There was a couple questions here, but I'm gonna just ask the one, I think. How do you approach the overall culture of advocating when both parents and staff are fearful of facing retribution? So that's a tough question, I know. It's probably complicated and probably takes more than a minute, but I just wanted to throw that out to you all and see what you think. Do you need me to read it again? Are y'all good? All right, go for it.
I'll go first. At the end of the day, you have to do what's right. And that's the bottom line. If you know that there's something wrong and you want to speak, don't speak out against it. Complacency is just going to make it grow and become far worse. So I get it. We are all fearful. Sometimes for myself, I walk that line. I work for the school district, but I'm also the PTA president in the state. And sometimes I have to make sure when I'm speaking, I'm very clear at which podium I'm speaking, from which microphone, because you can have that come back. But at the end of the day, with a clear heart and good intent, we have to speak up because we've got to protect our children.
I'll go next. We talked a little bit about relationships. I think when you build relationships with decision makers and you speak to them frankly, one-on-one, not making it like adversarial, like, yes, you can speak up at a school board meeting and it's your right to do that. But I think when you build relationships with your elected officials, especially the school board member, the superintendent, have these conversations, maybe one-on-one to start, then bringing in another person and talking about it and coming to consensus. Another really good way to make sure that you're not feeling like you're afraid to use your voice because of retribution is to find out if other organizations, like other coalitions that are like PTA, so maybe your teachers union or the school board, so they might have the same end goals. And when you come together as a team, as a coalition, it's more powerful and there's less chance of retribution. But you should never underestimate the power of your voice. That if you leave with nothing else tonight, please remember that your voice counts.
Laurie, what's your thoughts?
I would say absolutely. And I would probably say that even though you're being courageous as one, you're probably representing more voices out there that aren't being courageous. So there's power in numbers there too. So I think by you voicing that out, some others are going to join you and say, I'm so glad you said that. And then you can form a committee, and then that committee can go to leadership. Like it can build on each other, but it does take courage. Oh, look at Daphne.
I love it.
All right. So, and I see that courage is contagious. I'm gonna turn it back over to Rebecca. And if Rebecca wants to toss in her answer as well, probably love to hear that as well. But once again, everyone, thank you all for tuning in. And Rebecca, back to you.
Thank you. I just wanted to let everyone know I put in the chat a link to pta.org/school funding, where you can find additional information, including an episode of our podcast on this topic, some additional one-page resources, etc. I've also included our email, familyengagement@pta.org. If your question wasn't answered or you have any other kind of feedback, please don't hesitate to reach out. And then last but not least, I want to say a big thank you to all of our panelists, to our moderator, Marques, to Amanda for doing our lovely opening, and for all of you for joining us. We know you put a lot of time and energy into your PTA work, and we're very, very thankful. All right, well, have a great evening.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Don't hesitate to be in touch.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Have a good evening.